The day the earth shook, April 18th, 1906. A morning that began like any other until the ground itself turned against San Francisco. At 5:12 a.m., the city still slept beneath a lavender dawn. Horses clopped lazily along cobblestone streets. The smell of the bay drifted through open windows. Fishermen prepared their nets. Bakers tended their morning bread, and the rising sun began to gild the tips of Nob Hill's mansions. No one knew that in the next 60 seconds, the heartbeat of San Francisco would stop, and the modern age would be born from its ashes. Without warning, the ground groaned, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to rise from the core of the earth. Then came the shaking. Windows shattered, brick walls rippled like waves. In a heartbeat, entire blocks began to buckle. The great clock tower at the ferry building swayed violently. Steel rails twisted like ribbons. Across Market Street, gas lines snapped and chimneys crashed through roofs. The world tilted, split, and screamed. Eyewitnesses would later say it felt as if the earth had become a living thing. Horses bolted in terror. Trolley cars jumped their tracks. People stumbled barefoot into the streets, clutching children, photographs, and prayer books. 100 miles away, the tremors were still strong enough to wake miners in Nevada. But in San Francisco, the city itself seemed to dissolve. Buildings cracking, the ground opening to swallow anything unlucky enough to stand above it. The quake lasted less than a minute, but its power was unimaginable, an estimated 7.9 on the Richter scale. When the shaking finally stopped, a silence fell, eerie, breathless, and full of dread. Then came the sound that would haunt survivors forever: fire. The city ignites. At first, the flames seemed small, a gas lamp overturned here, a spark from a broken wire there. But within hours, dozens of fires were raging across the city. Gas mains, ruptured by the quake, fed the inferno. The water mains had also shattered, leaving firefighters with no pressure to fight back. Desperate men formed bucket lines from wells, barrels, and horse troughs, but it was like trying to drown a dragon with a spoon. The fire moved fast. Winds from the bay fanned the flames through wooden houses and narrow alleys. Whole districts vanished in minutes. Chinatown burned. The Mission burned. The proud Victorian homes of Nob Hill, symbols of the city's wealth, burned until only chimneys and iron fences remained. The fire department, led by Chief Dennis Sullivan, had been among the first to respond. But tragedy struck there too. Sullivan was fatally injured when a collapsing wall crushed his headquarters. Without his leadership, chaos spread. Mayor Eugene Schmitz took command and, in desperation, gave an order that would define the city's fate: to dynamite entire blocks to stop the fire's advance. Dynamite and desperation. Explosions tore through the city as soldiers and civilians blew up buildings, hoping to create fire breaks. But many of the men were untrained. They used too much dynamite, scattering burning debris that only spread the flames further. The inferno grew into a monster, one that devoured everything in its path. By the evening of April 18th, the sky glowed red over the bay. Ships anchored offshore could see the firestorm from miles away. The sound of collapsing buildings echoed through the night. The city's heart, from Market Street to City Hall, was unrecognizable. Yet amid the destruction, stories of courage emerged. Doctors treated the injured by candlelight. Priests led prayers among ruins. The U.S. Army, under General Frederick Funston, moved quickly to restore order, setting up camps, guarding supplies and rescuing survivors. Soldiers even fired warning shots to prevent looting. And still, the fire burned.
3 days of hell. For 3 relentless days, April 18th to 21st, the flames ruled San Francisco. Refugees poured into Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and the beaches, carrying what little they could. Mothers clutched babies wrapped in blankets of soot. Old men sat beside trunks of family heirlooms, staring blankly toward the burning skyline. At night, the glow from the city was so bright that ships could navigate without lanterns. Ash fell like snow on the bay. It seemed like the end of the world. By the time the final fires died down, more than 28,000 buildings had been destroyed. Over 500 city blocks, nearly 5 square miles, lay in ruins. Officially, around 3,000 people were dead, though historians now believe the true number was much higher. More than 200,000 were left homeless, nearly 3/4 of the city's population. A city on its knees. In the aftermath, the survivors faced a different kind of battle: hunger, disease, and despair. Camps of refugees filled the parks, living under makeshift tents provided by the army. Food lines stretched for blocks. Newspapers printed on scraps of paper announced, "San Francisco is no more." But even amid ruin, something remarkable began to happen. The city refused to die. Merchants reopened shops from wagons. Churches held outdoor services. Schools resumed under canvas shelters. Engineers mapped out new streets. Bankers salvaged vaults from the rubble and began lending again. San Franciscans, rich and poor, immigrant and native-born, came together with a single stubborn belief: we will rebuild. Born from ashes. Within weeks, rebuilding began. The army cleared the streets. Laborers worked around the clock to remove debris. Architects saw opportunity in the devastation, a chance to create a new, modern city of steel and glass. By the end of 1907, more than 20,000 buildings had been reconstructed. Market Street, once a corridor of ruin, began to pulse with life again. New theaters, restaurants, and electric streetcars symbolizing rebirth. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exhibition would later showcase San Francisco's miraculous recovery to the world, proving that even total destruction couldn't break its spirit. The fire had wiped the slate clean, but it had also ignited something unshakable: resilience. The legacy of the quake. The 1906 earthquake changed America forever. It led to breakthroughs in seismology, urban planning, and building safety. Engineers studied the city's ruins to understand how to make skyscrapers stand firm against the Earth's fury. The tragedy also gave rise to a new kind of hero: the ordinary citizen who refused to surrender to chaos. Today, more than 100 years later, the story of that April morning still echoes in the hills of San Francisco. Beneath the glass towers and cable cars, the city still rests on the same restless fault lines, a reminder that nature is both creator and destroyer. And yet every sunrise over the Golden Gate tells the same story, that from the ashes of disaster, hope can be rebuilt brick by brick. Inferno at dawn. From the ruins, fire erupted, a beast feeding on timber, oil, and chaos. For 3 relentless days, flames consumed everything in their path, while helpless citizens watched their city disappear into smoke and ash. At first, it was only smoke, a thin gray ribbon curling above a ruined block near Hayes Valley. A bystander might have mistaken it for a cooking fire or a spark from a fallen lantern. But within minutes, that fragile wisp turned into a roar, a deep, hungry sound that would soon devour the heart of San Francisco. The earthquake had shattered the city's bones. The fire would consume its soul. It was April 18th, 1906, just after sunrise. The ground still trembled with aftershocks, and people were crawling from the wreckage, calling out for loved ones. Somewhere in the chaos, a gas line hissed, and a spark, perhaps from a collapsing stove, lit the air. Flames leapt from window to window, racing up the dry wooden walls that lined every street. Within an hour, entire blocks were burning. What began as 10 small fires became one unholy storm. The birth of the firestorm. The city had been built to burn. Almost every structure was made of wood. The streets were coated with oil from countless lamps and machines. And beneath the ground ran a web of ruptured gas pipes leaking invisible fuel. Firefighters rushed to the scene, their horses lathered with sweat, wagons clattering over shattered cobblestone. But when they reached the hydrants, nothing came out. The earthquake had broken the main water lines that fed the city's reservoirs. When Captain John O'Connor turned the brass handle of the first hydrant on Market Street and no water emerged, he knew what that meant. San Francisco was defenseless. The fire spread faster than any man could chase it. By mid-morning, smoke blotted out the sun. The ferry building tower disappeared behind a wall of flame. People ran through the streets carrying whatever they could salvage: sewing machines, parakeets, pianos, children. And always, behind them, the beast followed. Chief Sullivan's last stand. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan had been one of the first injured when the quake hit, crushed beneath a falling wall at his headquarters. As he lay dying, his last words to his men were simple: "Save the city." But without him, the fire department was like a body without a head. Leadership fell into confusion. Some tried to pump water from the bay, others attempted to form bucket lines. None of it mattered. Mayor Eugene Schmitz took emergency control and gave a desperate order: use dynamite. If they couldn't stop the fire with water, they would stop it by destroying everything in its path. Soldiers from the nearby Presidio began blowing up entire rows of houses, hoping to starve the fire of fuel. The explosions thundered across the city, and in some places they worked. But in others, the untrained crews used too much dynamite, scattering embers and igniting even more fires. One officer later wrote, "We fought fire with fire, and the fire won." The city becomes an inferno. By that afternoon, the flames had merged into a single monstrous wall of heat. Temperatures reached over 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and fuse brick. The air itself seemed to burn. Birds dropped from the sky mid-flight. Telegraph poles glowed red. Across Market Street, the Call Building, once the tallest structure west of the Mississippi, became a torch. The ornate dome of City Hall collapsed in a shower of sparks. Churches, theaters, and mansions were swallowed up one by one. Eyewitnesses described the sound as like 1,000 furnaces breathing at once. The fire moved in waves, leaping from block to block, as though guided by a will of its own. By nightfall, the sky was no longer black, but blood red. Ships anchored in the bay reported seeing the glow from 50 miles away. One sailor said it looked like the entire continent was on fire. Heroes in the hellfire. Even as the city burned, its people refused to give up. Firefighters worked until their boots melted. Civilians joined the bucket lines, passing water from wells and fountains. Priests carried relics and children out of burning churches. At the Palace Hotel, guests refused to abandon the staff who were trapped inside. Together they carried the wounded through smoke so thick it turned day into night. At the Presidio, soldiers worked tirelessly to shelter refugees, setting up canvas tents across the lawns.
Volunteers formed supply lines to deliver food, blankets, and medicine. Amid all the chaos, humanity burned brighter than the flames themselves. Still, the fire advanced, block after block, neighborhood after neighborhood. Chinatown vanished overnight, leaving behind only scorched stone. Nob Hill, home to the city's elite, was reduced to glowing rubble. By the morning of April 19th, 1/3 of San Francisco was gone.
The Exodus. As the second day dawned, tens of thousands fled toward the western edges of the city. They carried everything from family portraits to sewing needles, fragments of the lives they once knew. Entire streets became rivers of refugees flowing toward the beaches where the army had established safe zones. Golden Gate Park turned into a sea of tents. Families huddled together under sheets and tarps as embers drifted down like snow. In the distance, the fire's roar never ceased. Mothers soothed crying children with lullabies, drowned by the crackle of destruction. Reporters who arrived by boat described a city of ghosts. The smoke hung so thick that ships had to navigate by compass. The stench of burning wood, cloth, and flesh mixed with the salt air. Unforgettable, inescapable. One survivor, a nurse named Clara Reynolds, later wrote, "The fire did not just destroy our homes, it erased our yesterdays." A city at war with itself. By the third day, soldiers were enforcing martial law. They patrolled the streets to stop looting and, in extreme cases, to shoot anyone caught stealing. It was a brutal order, but in the chaos, it kept the city from tearing itself apart. Mayor Schmitz's words echoed through the telegrams sent across the nation. San Francisco must be rebuilt. But first, it had to survive. The dynamite crews redoubled their efforts, blowing fire breaks near Van Ness Avenue. This time, they succeeded. The fire had finally run out of fuel, not because of rain or miracle, but because there was simply nothing left to burn. By the evening of April 21, the flames began to die. What remained was a silent wasteland. Over 500 city blocks were gone, more than 28,000 buildings reduced to ash. The once proud jewel of the Pacific now smoldered beneath a sky of smoke and sorrow. Out of the smoke. As dawn broke on April 22, the survivors saw the ruins for the first time in daylight. Streets they had walked their entire lives were unrecognizable, reduced to gray dust and twisted metal. The only sounds were the creak of broken beams and the distant toll of a church bell that somehow survived. And yet, there was life. In the camps, people shared food, sang songs, and began planning how to rebuild. Refugees helped one another search for missing family. Engineers took notes on what had failed, what kind of foundations had collapsed, which materials had burned fastest. Out of tragedy, knowledge began to root. The newspapers that survived printed a single defiant headline: "San Francisco will rise again." The legacy of the inferno. The Great Fire of 1906 burned for 3 days and nights, destroying nearly everything from the Embarcadero to Van Ness. But from that devastation came rebirth. The disaster taught America how fragile progress could be, and how powerful the human spirit truly was. It led to stronger building codes, modern firefighting systems, and the creation of seismic research that would shape the future of every city on the West Coast. The inferno that once consumed San Francisco became a lesson written in flame, that resilience is forged in fire. Today, when the morning fog rolls over the Golden Gate, it hides a city that remembers. Beneath the skyscrapers and streetcars lies the memory of an inferno that began at dawn, when the earth had already shaken and the flames came to finish what it started. But San Francisco, the city born from ash, refused to vanish. It rose, scarred but shining,
a living monument to courage, rebirth, and the fire that could not burn its spirit away.
Heroes amid the flames. Firefighters, soldiers, and ordinary citizens joined forces in desperate acts of courage. With no water left, dynamite became their last defense, blowing up buildings to stop the unstoppable. At dawn on April 19, 1906, San Francisco looked like the edge of hell. The ground still quivered from the quake that had struck the day before, and the air shimmered with heat. Entire blocks were already gone, swallowed by the inferno that roared from one neighborhood to the next. People ran through smoke so thick they could barely see the sky. The water mains were shattered, the hoses lay dry, and the city was defenseless. But amid the chaos, a strange kind of order began to rise, a courage that burned as fiercely as the flames themselves. The firefighters, soldiers, and ordinary citizens of San Francisco refused to surrender. They would not let their city die without a fight. The firefighters' last stand. Chief Dennis Sullivan had been mortally injured during the earthquake, crushed beneath falling bricks when his station collapsed. He was gone, but his men still carried his orders: save the city. Captain Edward J. Walsh, one of the senior fire officers, gathered his crew near Market Street. Their hoses hung limp, useless without pressure. The men's faces were blackened with soot, their eyes bloodshot from smoke. But they stayed at their posts. When the hydrants ran dry, they turned to whatever they could find: barrels of beer, laundry tubs, even milk. One exhausted firefighter later recalled, "We pumped everything that would flow through a hose." They soaked blankets and beat the flames with wet sacks. They pulled families from collapsing buildings. In some places, they fought the fire inch by inch, winning ground that would be lost again an hour later. Every man knew they could die at any moment. Still, they fought on. By noon, the fire had surrounded City Hall. The great granite structure, a symbol of civic pride, groaned under the heat until its copper dome crashed inward in a shower of sparks. The firefighters watched helplessly. "There was nothing we could do," Walsh whispered. "It was like fighting the sun." Dynamite and determination. When word reached Mayor Eugene Schmitz that the water system was gone, he made a grim decision. If the fire could not be stopped, the city would have to destroy itself to survive. He sent a desperate telegram to General Frederick Funston, the commander of the U.S. Army at the Presidio. "Send troops immediately. The city is burning." Within an hour, Funston's soldiers were marching through the smoke-filled streets, their faces wrapped in rags. They carried rifles, shovels, and boxes of dynamite. Their mission was simple: to blow up entire rows of buildings, creating fire breaks to starve the blaze of fuel. But the plan was far from perfect. The men were soldiers, not demolition experts. They packed too much powder, igniting new fires instead of stopping them. The explosions tore through the city, scattering flaming debris. Yet, even as the blast spread more chaos, the soldiers refused to give up. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Lovell described the moment in his journal. "We were not fighting men. We were fighting fire, and it was the most merciless enemy of all." As day turned to night, the soldiers blew up block after block, gambling that destruction could be salvation. Ordinary heroes. Not everyone who fought the flames wore a uniform. Across the city, ordinary citizens became heroes. In Chinatown, a grocer named Ah Fang organized his neighbors to dig trenches around their homes, filling them with water from rain barrels. When the flames came close, they doused their roofs with wet sheets and stood watch all night. Many of their homes were destroyed, but their efforts saved lives. In the Mission District, a nurse named Clara Reynolds refused to leave her patients behind.
She and a handful of volunteers turned a schoolhouse into a field hospital, carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers made from doors and blankets. We had no medicine, she later wrote, only courage. In the downtown district, a group of newsmen from the San Francisco Chronicle rescued printing presses from the fire and set up shop in a barn miles away. The next morning, they published a single headline in bold type: "Earthquake and Fire. San Francisco Still Lives." These were not just acts of survival, they were acts of defiance, proof that even in ruin, the city's heart still beat.
The Soldier's Code. General Funston declared martial law, though technically without federal authorization. Order had to be maintained. Soldiers patrolled the streets, preventing looting and violence. Anyone caught stealing from the dead or from the ruins was warned, and sometimes shot. For many, the soldiers were both saviors and executioners. They distributed food, rescued survivors, and maintained peace. But their methods were harsh. In one case, a soldier shot a man accused of taking shoes from a burning store. The incident was later described as a tragedy within a tragedy. Despite the brutality, the soldiers' discipline kept the city from falling into anarchy. They set up camp kitchens, medical tents, and supply stations. Thousands of refugees, many of them immigrants, lined up for rations of bread, coffee, and beans. At night, soldiers and civilians shared fires in the parks, their faces glowing red from the reflection of the city's burning skyline. "We were all the same," one soldier later recalled. "Uniforms didn't matter, only survival did." The night the city fought back. By the second night, the fire reached the western districts. The dynamite teams worked non-stop, blowing up buildings to protect Van Ness Avenue, the last barrier before the flames could sweep into the unburned western neighborhoods. The explosions could be heard from miles. Windows shattered. The ground shook again, this time from human hands. As dawn approached, something miraculous happened. The fire began to slow. The wide streets of Van Ness, combined with the fire breaks and a shift in the wind, finally starved the inferno. The city had sacrificed half of itself, but the other half had been saved. When the final embers died on April 21, 3 days after the quake, San Francisco was unrecognizable. Over 28,000 buildings were gone. More than 200,000 people were homeless. The air still smelled of smoke and salt and loss. But it was also the smell of victory, hard, bitter, and earned. Ashes and aftermath. When the fires finally ceased, the survivors emerged like ghosts from the ruins. The army set up camps across Golden Gate Park and the Presidio. Families slept under canvas tents stamped U.S. Army. Priests held open-air masses. Women cooked soup over small fires made from salvaged wood. The firefighters, soldiers, and volunteers who had fought for 3 sleepless days became the city's new legends. Newspapers across the country printed their names. Children called them the men who fought the sun. Captain Walsh, exhausted and covered in soot, refused to rest until every smoldering ember was extinguished. When reporters asked him what kept him going, he said quietly, "A firefighter's job doesn't end when the fire dies. It ends when the city breathes again." That spirit of duty, courage, and unity would become San Francisco's greatest inheritance. The rebirth begins. Out of destruction came determination. The very people who had fought the fire became the first to rebuild. Soldiers turned their shovels from digging trenches to clearing rubble. Firefighters helped map out new water mains and safety systems. Citizens volunteered to plant the first tents that would grow into new neighborhoods. By the end of 1906, reconstruction had already begun. New building codes were written, emphasizing steel and reinforced concrete instead of wood. The Army's temporary camps evolved into organized districts with schools, stores, and electricity. The same men and women who had fought shoulder to shoulder against the flames now worked side by side to rebuild their city, brick by brick, dream by dream. San Francisco was reborn not through money or politics, but through people who refused to let fear have the last word. Legacy of courage. The Great Fire of 1906 destroyed almost everything, but it could not destroy courage. The heroism of those 3 days became part of America's identity, a testament to the resilience that defines the human spirit. Historians still study the tactics, the explosions, the failure of the water system, but behind every fact lies a human story. A firefighter who carried a child through flames, a soldier who blew up a street to save a neighborhood, a nurse who stayed when others fled. These were not extraordinary people. They were ordinary people who chose bravery when it mattered most. Today, more than a century later, the city that rose from the ashes still remembers them. Every April, when the sirens wail at 5:12 a.m., the moment the earthquake struck, San Franciscans pause in silence, not just for the loss, but for the courage that followed. Because when the world burned, they stayed. And that is how San Francisco lived.
Exodus and desperation. Tens of thousands fled to the beaches and parks, carrying what little they could. Families huddled under makeshift tents, unsure if San Francisco or their lives would ever be the same again. The dawn of April 19, 1906, broke over a city unrecognizable. The once proud skyline of San Francisco, domes, towers, and the gilded peaks of Nob Hill now lay buried beneath a sea of ash and smoke. The ground was still warm beneath people's feet, the air heavy with the smell of charred wood and despair. Everywhere, the sound of footsteps. Men, women, and children streamed through the ruined streets, tens of thousands, perhaps more, fleeing the inferno that had consumed their homes. Some carried trunks or blankets, others clutched only each other. Horses dragged wagons piled with furniture and cages of frightened animals, and above it all, the fire raged behind them like a living thing, roaring, advancing, devouring everything that stood in its way. The exodus had begun. The Great Flight. By mid-morning, San Francisco had become a city on the move. From every corner, the Mission, Chinatown, the Marina, people poured toward the western edges of the city, seeking refuge in open spaces away from the flames. Golden Gate Park became the first sanctuary, its vast green lawns filled with refugees by the thousands, carrying makeshift bundles and heirlooms rescued from the ruins. Entire families crowded beneath the trees. Mothers wrapped babies in curtains torn from burning homes. Fathers stood guard over piles of salvaged belongings, trunks of silverware, photo albums, even pianos. Witnesses later wrote that the park looked like a sea of humanity. Smoke hung thick as fog, and ash drifted down like snow. The sound of coughing, crying, and the distant crackle of the still-burning city blended into a single mournful hum. At the Presidio, the U.S. Army established emergency camps. Soldiers handed out rations of hardtack and coffee, helping the sick and wounded. But there were too many mouths to feed, too many hands reaching for help. Within hours, the city's parks, beaches, and open fields were overflowing with refugees. Nearly 200,000 people, more than half the city's population, carrying the past on their backs. Each person's flight told a story of loss and of stubborn hope. A tailor named Samuel Gross pushed a wheelbarrow piled with bolts of fabric through the smoke, saying he would reopen shop as soon as there was a street left to sell on. An elderly Chinese woman walked barefoot, carrying a birdcage with 2 canaries,
the only living thing she had saved from her home. On Van Ness Avenue, a group of children dragged a red toy wagon filled with books rescued from their school library. "We didn't want them to burn," one of them said later. Some people fled with only the clothes on their backs. Others carried absurd treasures: silver teapots, portraits, clocks, as though holding on to proof that life before the quake had been real. One man famously pulled a grand piano on a wagon all the way to the edge of Golden Gate Park, then sat down amid the ruins and played Chopin as the city burned. Even in despair, San Francisco refused to surrender its soul. Desperation in the camps. As the sun set on the second day, the fires still burned across the eastern half of the city. The refugees in the makeshift camps could see the orange glow lighting up the night sky. The earth itself seemed to flicker. The army distributed tents stamped U.S. and established order amid the chaos. But food was scarce and water scarcer. Wells had been contaminated, and every drop had to be rationed. Lines for bread stretched for blocks. Refugees took turns boiling water and sharing it between families. Doctors set up medical tents to treat burns and broken bones. Nurses bandaged wounds with torn linen. A smallpox outbreak was narrowly contained by the Army's medical corps. In the Presidio, General Frederick Funston worked tirelessly with his men to maintain discipline and calm. He sent soldiers to patrol the camps not only to keep order, but also to offer comfort. For many refugees, these uniformed figures, once symbols of war, became their protectors. One young mother told a reporter, "When I saw the soldiers, I knew we would live through this. They looked like hope." A city without sound. On the third day, the fires began to die. What remained was silence, eerie, thick, almost sacred. The people in the camps looked toward the city and saw nothing but a smoldering wasteland. The silence was not peace. It was exhaustion. Many sat motionless for hours, staring at the horizon where their homes had been. "We were too tired to cry," one survivor later wrote. It felt like the end of the world. Some refused to believe it. Rumors spread through the camps that the water system had been restored, that the city would be rebuilt in weeks, that the president himself was on his way. When President Theodore Roosevelt did send aid from Washington, it felt like a miracle. Relief trains began arriving from across California, carrying food, blankets, and medicine. The Red Cross, under the direction of Clara Barton's successors, established field kitchens and medical stations. Newspapers from other cities sent reporters and photographers documenting the city of the homeless. What they captured were faces, weary, dirt-streaked, but unbroken.
Faith among the ruins. Religion became a powerful comfort. Every morning, priests and pastors held open-air masses in Golden Gate Park. People knelt in the grass while the smoke still rose behind them. Hymns echoed across the fields, songs of grief, gratitude, and determination. A rabbi led prayers near the Presidio, blessing those who had lost their homes. A Buddhist monk from Chinatown chanted quietly beside a smoldering temple site. Amid all the ruin, faith became a bridge, linking the living to what they had lost and to what they hoped to rebuild. Even the city's famed brothels and saloons joined in the relief effort. Women who once worked the red light district cooked for the wounded. Saloon owners gave away barrels of whiskey to disinfect wounds and steady nerves. Tragedy had erased the lines that once divided the city. Rich or poor, sinner or saint, everyone was the same now, a survivor. Acts of kindness in the ashes. History often remembers the earthquake and fire for its destruction, but those who lived through it remembered something else: kindness. Strangers shared bread, blankets, and stories. A butcher gave away his entire stock of meat before it spoiled. A banker handed out his personal savings to help families rebuild. Children, despite everything, played tag between the tents, their laughter carrying through the smoky air. One photograph taken in Golden Gate Park shows a small girl offering a cup of water to a soldier, a single act that came to symbolize the humanity that endured amid disaster. "The city didn't just burn," wrote journalist William Bronson years later. "It also lit up the best parts of the human heart." The will to rebuild. By late April, the Exodus camps had become small cities of their own. Streets were organized, tents numbered, and committees formed to manage supplies. Refugees began talking about the future, not if the city would be rebuilt, but when. Engineers walked through the ruins, taking notes for the reconstruction. Architects sketched blueprints for a new, stronger San Francisco, one built of steel and concrete instead of wood. The army began clearing debris, using dynamite one last time, this time not to destroy, but to rebuild. In May, the first makeshift wooden homes, known as earthquake cottages, began appearing in rows across the parks. Families decorated them with curtains and flower pots. Children painted them bright colors. A year later, those cottages would become permanent homes, reminders that even the greatest destruction could not defeat the will to endure. A phoenix rising. By the summer of 1906, the smoke had lifted and green shoots began to sprout through the ashes. San Francisco, once broken, starving, and scattered, was finding its heartbeat again. The city's rebirth was not just physical, but spiritual. The people who had fled in terror returned with courage. The businessmen who had lost fortunes started new companies. The artists who had watched their studios burn began painting again, this time scenes of fire and hope. From the beaches to the hills, from the refugee camps to the ruins, one belief united them all. San Francisco would rise again. And it did. Within a decade, it would become one of the most modern and beautiful cities in the world, rebuilt by the very hands that once carried its ashes. Legacy of the Exodus. The Great Fire and Earthquake of 1906 were not just events in history. They were a defining moment for a nation still growing into the 20th century. The Exodus from San Francisco became a lesson in resilience, unity, and human endurance. When disaster struck, the people did not wait for rescue. They became the rescuers. They proved that civilization is not measured by buildings, but how we stand when those buildings fall. Today, Golden Gate Park and the Presidio remain peaceful sanctuaries, but beneath their quiet lawns lies the memory of that desperate migration, when tens of thousands carried not just their possessions, but the spirit of a city that refused to die.
Rising from ruin. When the smoke finally cleared, what remained was not defeat, but determination. Against all odds, the city's spirit refused to die. Architects, laborers, and dreamers came together to rebuild what the fire had taken. The dawn after disaster is always eerily quiet. On April 21, 1906, San Francisco awoke beneath a blanket of gray ash. Smoke still curled upward from the ruins, and the smell of burnt wood and oil lingered like a memory that refused to fade. The city, once vibrant, musical, alive, now looked like the aftermath of an apocalypse. Churches stood roofless. The grand hotels of Nob Hill were hollow shells. Telegraph Hill had lost its voice. But among the ashes, something else began to stir. A pulse, faint but steady. It was the heartbeat of a city that refused to surrender. For 3 days, San Francisco had been swallowed by fire. Now, as the last embers died, its people looked upon the ruins and made a collective vow.
We will rise again. The morning after the inferno. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the smoke, the scale of the devastation became clear. Over 28,000 buildings were gone. Nearly 500 city blocks lay in ruin. Half the population, more than 200,000 souls, were homeless. The city's beating heart had been burned out, replaced by silence. Yet out of that silence came action. From the refugee camps in Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, survivors began to return to the ruins of their neighborhoods. They searched for familiar streets buried under rubble. Some wept as they found the blackened remnants of family homes. Others simply stood in awe, not of destruction, but of survival. "San Francisco ain't dead," one newspaper vendor shouted through the smoke. "She's just catching her breath." And he was right. The first sparks of rebirth. Within days of the fire's end, the city's leaders and citizens gathered at the Fairmont Hotel, one of the few buildings still standing, though heavily damaged. The walls were cracked, the marble scorched, but hope flickered there. Mayor Eugene Schmitz stood before a crowd of weary men and women, business owners, architects, and laborers alike, and declared, "We shall rebuild San Francisco, greater and nobler than ever before." The words became a rallying cry. Newspapers echoed it across the country. The Chronicle printed headlines like, "Phoenix of the Pacific shall rise from its ashes." And so began the greatest rebuilding effort in American history. Within a week, makeshift stores appeared among the ruins. Merchants set up wooden stalls beside the skeletons of their old buildings. One sign read, "Fresh bread baked daily, fireproof recipe." The humor was grim, but it was fuel for the soul. San Francisco had decided that laughter too was part of survival. The builders of a dream. Architects and engineers flooded into the city like soldiers to a battlefield. Among them was Daniel Burnham, famed designer of Chicago's post-fire reconstruction. Invited by former Mayor James Phelan, Burnham proposed an ambitious master plan, grand boulevards, sweeping parks, and a civic center modeled after Paris. Though his vision was too costly to realize immediately, it planted a powerful seed that San Francisco would not just rebuild what was lost, but reinvent itself entirely. At the same time, local architects like Willis Polk, John Galen Howard, and Julia Morgan began crafting new designs that embraced strength and resilience. Morgan, California's first licensed female architect, pioneered the use of reinforced concrete, a material that would become the foundation of modern earthquake-resistant construction. Their work would ensure that the next San Francisco would not fall so easily. Meanwhile, laborers worked around the clock. Carpenters slept in tents beside their work sites. Blacksmiths forged tools out of melted steel from the ruins. Women sewed uniforms for workers, cooked meals for entire crews, and organized relief kitchens in the parks. It wasn't just the architects who rebuilt San Francisco. It was everyone. The spirit that would not burn. By summer 1906, the clang of hammers replaced the crackle of flames. Streets once lined with rubble now echoed with the rhythmic sounds of saws, carts, and voices shouting orders. The army built thousands of earthquake cottages, small wooden houses rented to families for $2 a month. Painted bright colors and planted with flower boxes, they transformed refugee camps into neighborhoods. Many of those cottages still stand today, quiet monuments to the resilience of ordinary people. Water mains were repaired, streetcars returned, and businesses reopened with a courage that bordered on defiance. One saloon, rebuilt entirely from salvaged wood, posted a sign outside, "Open, hell couldn't close us." This was not just optimism, it was identity. San Francisco's people were telling the world that the fire might have destroyed their city, it hadn't touched their spirit. It was the spirit of rebuilding.
A city reimagined. The reconstruction attracted dreamers from across America. Investors poured in money. Artists and engineers came seeking opportunity. The disaster had wiped the slate clean, and visionaries saw a chance to build something new. The city's downtown was redesigned with wide streets and stronger foundations. The ferry building, its clock tower still standing proudly after the quake, became the new symbol of endurance. Banks and theaters rose from the ashes, this time built with steel frames instead of timber. Electric streetlights returned to Market Street, illuminating the reborn heart of San Francisco. People gathered just to see the glow, a symbol that the city's pulse had returned. By 1908, nearly 20,000 new buildings stood where rubble had been. In just 2 years, San Francisco had rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible. It wasn't just a city restored, it was a city reborn, brighter, stronger, and more beautiful than before. Trials along the way. But rebirth did not come without pain. The rebuilding effort faced corruption, political chaos, and economic strain. The graft trials of 1907 exposed bribery within the city's leadership, threatening to stain the very triumph they had fought for. Yet, even amid scandal, the construction never stopped. The people worked as if redemption itself were being built brick by brick. There were shortages of labor and materials. Lumber prices soared. Some neighborhoods were rebuilt hastily and collapsed again in later years. But through every setback, San Franciscans held on to the same unshakable belief that they were building more than homes. They were building hope. As one worker carved into a cornerstone near Van Ness Avenue, "From ruin, we rise." The fair that proved the world wrong. By 1915, less than a decade after the catastrophe, the world returned to San Francisco. The city hosted the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a world fair celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal and, unofficially, the triumph of a city reborn. On the shores of the Marina District, pavilions gleamed in gold and white. The Palace of Fine Arts, designed by Bernard Maybeck, rose like a temple from the ashes, a dream made real. Visitors from every continent walked through the fairgrounds in awe. They marveled not just at the architecture, but at the story behind it. One New York journalist wrote, "San Francisco was buried in flame and shadow. Now she stands in sunlight, a living miracle." For the world, the exposition was proof that tragedy could be transformed into triumph. For San Francisco, it was a declaration. The city was not a victim of history, it was a maker of it. From the rubble to the skyline. In the years that followed, San Francisco continued to grow, not in spite of the earthquake, but because of it. The disaster had forced innovation in architecture, engineering, and civic planning that would influence cities worldwide. Steel-frame skyscrapers, flexible foundations, and new fire codes became standard. The lessons learned in 1906 would later help protect cities from Los Angeles to Tokyo. The earthquake had taken lives, but it had also given humanity a blueprint for survival. And beneath the new skyline, the heart of old San Francisco still beat strong. The streetcars rattled up the hills, the fog rolled in from the bay, and the people, the stubborn, fearless people, carried on with pride. They had not merely rebuilt their city, they had redefined what it meant to endure. Legacy of the rebirth. Today, when dawn breaks over the Golden Gate, the city glows not just with light, but with memory. Beneath its foundations lie the ashes of 1906, a reminder of how fragile civilization can be and how fierce the human spirit truly is. Every April 18th, at precisely 5:12 a.m., thousands gather at Lotta's Fountain downtown, the same meeting point survivors used after the quake, to honor those who rebuilt from nothing. Sirens echo across the city, and for one silent minute, San Francisco remembers. They don't mourn destruction. They celebrate endurance. The fire took the city's skyline. The earthquake shattered its streets, but neither could touch its soul. From ruin, San Francisco rose, and in doing so, it taught the world that resilience is not about what you lose, but what you dare to build again.
They called it the end of San Francisco. The city that once glittered on the edge of the Pacific lay in ruins, its skyline reduced to smoke and dust, its people scattered, its hope buried under ashes. Yet from this devastation, something extraordinary happened. What perished in the fire was not the city's soul, but its fear. From ruin rose resilience, a new San Francisco, reborn like a phoenix from the Pacific. When the fires finally died in the spring of 1906, San Francisco was barely recognizable. Nearly 500 city blocks were reduced to rubble. More than 28,000 buildings were gone. Over 200,000 residents, more than half the population, were homeless, sleeping under tents in parks and along the charred remains of Market Street. What had once been the Paris of the West now resembled a battlefield after the end of the world. But amid the smoldering ruins, something unbreakable stirred. Survivors refused to see the fire as an ending. For them, it was a challenge, a test of will, courage, and unity. Mayor Eugene Schmitz, though criticized for his martial law tactics during the blaze, now stood before the people with a vow: San Francisco shall rise again. Newspapers echoed the promise. The Call, one of the few papers still publishing, printed its morning edition from Oakland with a single defiant headline: San Francisco will be rebuilt. Reclaiming hope. The first step to rebuilding was survival. Refugee camps spread across the city, from Golden Gate Park to the Presidio. Army officers distributed food and clothing, while civic leaders organized makeshift schools and churches beneath canvas tents. In the ashes of Nob Hill, families gathered around campfires, sharing memories of what was lost and dreams of what might return. Engineers from across the country arrived to assess the damage. They discovered that the earthquake itself, though powerful, had caused far less destruction than the fires that followed. Wooden structures tightly packed along the city's steep hills had fueled a chain reaction of infernos that turned entire neighborhoods into furnaces. The lesson was clear. If San Francisco were to live again, it could not be built as it was before. It needed stronger foundations, better planning, and modern materials. Enter a new generation of dreamers, architects, laborers, and visionaries who saw opportunity where others saw only ruin. Among them was Daniel Burnham, the famed Chicago architect who had designed the 1893 World's Fair. Burnham arrived with an ambitious plan: wide boulevards, grand civic centers, and parks modeled after Paris. His vision promised a city more beautiful than any before it. But time was against him. The people were desperate to rebuild, to reopen their shops and homes. They couldn't wait for an idealized blueprint. Within weeks, construction began on a massive scale, not always orderly, but fiercely determined. Rebuilding the heart. By the summer of 1906, carpenters' hammers echoed across the ruins. New wooden homes, simple but sturdy, began to rise from the debris. The ferry building, though scorched, reopened as a symbol of endurance. Market Street, the city's lifeline, was cleared of rubble and regraded. Bricklayers and steelworkers labored side by side, often sleeping beside their work sites. It was a time of improvisation and innovation. Water pipes were laid deeper underground to prevent future ruptures. Concrete, still a relatively new building material, became the foundation of a safer city. San Francisco's famed cable car lines were repaired and extended, reconnecting the city's shattered neighborhoods. And behind every beam and brick was a story of resilience. Chinese immigrants, long marginalized and driven from Chinatown during the fire, returned to rebuild their district, this time in stone and brick rather than wood. Their new pagoda-style buildings would become one of the city's most iconic sights. Women, too, played a vital role. In the relief camps, they organized soup kitchens, schools, and orphanages. Many took up jobs in offices and factories for the first time, fueling both the city's reconstruction and a quiet social revolution. The United States Army, which had once been called to enforce martial law, now provided logistics and manpower for rebuilding bridges, wharves, and public utilities. It was one of the first great collaborations between military engineering and civilian recovery in American history.
The spirit that couldn't burn. By 1907, the skyline began to rise again. The Palace Hotel reopened, grander and safer than before. Union Square buzzed with life. Market Street glittered once more with the lights of electric trolleys. The people of San Francisco, who had once watched their world vanish in flames, were now watching it reborn before their eyes. But the transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The disaster had reshaped the city's identity. San Franciscans had seen death and despair, yet emerged with renewed pride and unity. Wealthy and poor, immigrant and native-born, all had shared the same tense, the same fear, the same will to survive. The fire that destroyed their homes had burned away something deeper, the arrogance of prosperity, the illusion of invincibility. What remained was humility, courage, and a sense of shared destiny. The phrase, "the city that knows how," was born during this era, a slogan that captured the grit and ingenuity that now defined San Francisco. The modern metropolis. As the years passed, the city transformed beyond recognition. Skyscrapers of steel and glass replaced fragile wooden houses. The new City Hall rose like a beacon of rebirth, its dome rivaling that of the U.S. Capitol. The Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915 showcased to the world a rejuvenated San Francisco, modern, elegant, and confident. Visitors who had once mourned its loss now marveled at its resurrection. They called it a miracle of the Pacific. The fair itself became a symbol of triumph, a celebration of what human resilience could achieve after unimaginable loss. The exposition grounds, built on what had once been rubble-strewn shoreline, gave rise to a new district, the Marina, still standing today as a testament to rebirth. The Phoenix rises. San Francisco's story did not end with its reconstruction. The lessons of 1906 would echo through generations, influencing city planning, architecture, and disaster management across America. The use of reinforced concrete, the creation of seismic building codes, and the importance of emergency coordination all found their roots in the ashes of that fateful year. Even today, when the earth trembles beneath California's coast, the city remembers and stands ready. Its skyline gleams not just with steel, but with memory. Every tower, every bridge, every street carries a whisper of that long-ago inferno and the unyielding spirit that conquered it. As historian Will Irwin once wrote, "It was not the earthquake that destroyed San Francisco, it was the fire, but it was neither that could destroy the people." Indeed, what rose from those ashes was not merely a rebuilt city, but a reborn soul. The legacy. More than a century later, San Francisco remains a symbol of resilience, a place where adversity sparks innovation, where tragedy gives birth to transformation. Its people still carry the legacy of that fire, the understanding that beauty can emerge from chaos and strength from sorrow.
When modern visitors walk through Chinatown, gaze up at City Hall's dome, or ride a cable car down Nob Hill, they're not just seeing architecture, they're witnessing the living proof of rebirth. San Francisco, the phoenix on the Pacific, did not just survive, it soared.